The Christmas lights were still blinking on the front porch when I heard it. I was 15, standing in the hallway in my socks, holding a ceramic star I'd painted in kindergarten gold on both sides. My handprint pressed into the back like a signature nobody asked for. I was going to hang it on the tree. My father and I had done it together every December since I could remember. Him lifting me up toward the highest branch while my mother counted to 3. She had been gone 2 years by then, remarried to someone in Phoenix who didn't like children, which meant she didn't like me, but the tradition had survived her leaving. At least, I thought it had. My father's voice came through the kitchen door, low and even, the voice he used when he was trying to sound reasonable. "I can move the guest bed in before the 23rd, he said. "Diane needs her own space when her girls visit. And honestly, with Maya going to Karen's for the break, it just makes sense." Diane's voice, softer, grateful in a way that made my stomach turn. "That would mean so much, Robert. Brooke loves that room. The light in there is just perfect in the mornings." I stood in the hallway and looked at the star in my hand. The gold paint had chipped a little along one edge. I had always meant to touch it up. I set it on the end table beside the coat rack, very gently, as if it might break. Then I went to my room, still my room, for 3 more weeks, and sat on the floor with my back against the bed, listening to the furnace tick. Karen wasn't expecting me. When I called her that night from the upstairs bathroom with the door locked, she picked up on the 4th ring, her voice careful the way it always was when she hadn't thought about me in a while. "Honey," she said, "Christmas is kind of complicated this year. Gary's parents are coming in, and the house is small. You know how it is. Can you do the week after New Year's?" I pressed my back against the cold tile wall and said sure. I said that was fine. I had gotten very good at saying things were fine. My father drove me to the bus station on December 22nd with my duffel bag and $40 and a hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to for him to feel like a good person. He told me Karen was looking forward to seeing me. His voice was the same voice he used to tell me the dentist wouldn't hurt, sure and warm and not quite true. The bus smelled like diesel and stale coffee. I watched Millbrook, Vermont disappear through the foggy window, the white steeple, the covered bridge on Route 9, the hardware store where my grandfather used to buy seed, and I tried to remember what it felt like when all of this had been mine. Karen's apartment in Hartford was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled permanently of someone else's cooking. Gary was polite in the way that strangers are polite, nodding when I entered rooms and finding reasons to leave them. Karen made us all dinner on Christmas Eve, chicken that was a little dry, and we watched a movie nobody wanted to watch, and at 11 o'clock she hugged me and said she was so glad I'd come, and I believed her for about half a second before I heard the relief in her voice. I slept on the pull-out couch and stared at the textured ceiling for most of that night, thinking about the star on the end table at home, wondering if my father had found it, wondering if he'd known what it meant that I'd left it there. I came home on the 28th. The guest bed was in my room. Pink comforter folded back like a hotel turn-down, Brooke's initials embroidered on the pillowcase. My things had been moved to the basement, stacked in cardboard boxes like an archive of someone who no longer lived there. My father was in the garage when I got back. He looked up from the workbench with that same expression, warm, a little too busy, already halfway back to whatever he had been doing. "We kept all your stuff safe," he said. "Just temporary, while we figure out the room situation." I nodded. I was good at nodding. Brooke was 16, a year older than me, with dark hair and her mother's laugh and the comfortable certainty of someone who has never been made to feel like a guest in her own life. She was not unkind. That was the part I could never explain to people later. None of them were cruel. Diane didn't scream at me, or steal my things, or lock me out of the bathroom. She was pleasant and organized, and she made casseroles from scratch, and she loved my father, and my father loved her, and Brooke fit into their house the way the last piece of a puzzle fits, without effort or adjustment, like she had always belonged there. And I was the piece from a different box. The shape was wrong. By February, my boxes were still in the basement. I started doing homework at the kitchen table of our neighbor across the street, Mrs. Sullivan had been there since before I was born, a retired English teacher with silver-streaked hair and a small dog named Hemingway, and a kitchen that always smelled like something baking. She had noticed, without saying anything, that I had started sitting on her porch steps after school. One afternoon, she simply opened the door and said the table was free if I wanted to use it. I did. I came back the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that. Her son, Patrick, was away at grad school in Chicago. Her husband, Carl, worked long hours at the hospital. It was mostly just her and Hemingway and the kitchen, and she let me fill it up with my backpack and my textbooks and my silence, and she never once asked me to explain myself. That spring, my father told me Diane was moving in permanently. "We're going to make it official," he said. "I want you to be happy about this. She's good for this family." I looked at him across the kitchen table. The star wasn't on the mantel anymore. I had checked. I couldn't find it anywhere in the house. "Where's the ornament?" I asked. "The one I made in kindergarten." His face shifted, just slightly. "Diane did a little redecorating. I think she organized the ornament boxes. I'm sure it's somewhere." It was not somewhere. I looked. I checked every box in the storage closet, moved things around quietly while Diane was out, while my father was in the garage. The star was gone. The handprint was gone. The thing I had made with my own 5-year-old hands in gold paint and more love than I had words for at the time gone. I went to Mrs. Sullivan's that night and sat at her kitchen table and didn't say anything for a long time. She brought me tea and didn't ask. That was the thing about her she never pushed. She just kept showing up with tea and patience, like she understood that some things need to unspool at their own pace. Eventually I told her about the ornament. She listened with her hands wrapped around her mug, and when I was done she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Some losses are small and total at the same time. That one sounds like both." I cried at her kitchen table for the first time. I hadn't cried since the bus station in December. It wasn't graceful. She pushed the paper napkins toward me without comment, and Hemingway put his small warm head on my knee, and I let it all out. The ornament and the boxes, and Karen's pull-out couch, and my father's voice saying, "Just temporary," and the way Brooke's initials were embroidered on the pillowcase like she had always been the daughter of that room. I stayed for dinner. Carl came home and made spaghetti and pretended not to notice my red eyes, and we talked about the Red Sox and a book Mrs. Sullivan was rereading, and nothing that required me to explain myself. When I walked back across the street at 9 o'clock, the lights were on in my father's house, warm and yellow, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at them. They looked like someone else's home. Maybe they always had and I had just refused to see it. Junior year, I applied for a summer internship at a small literary magazine based in Burlington. Mrs. Sullivan proofread my application letter twice and told me it was strong and meant it. I got in. My father said, "Good for you," and went back to whatever he was watching on television. Diane said, "Oh, how exciting," in the voice she used when she was thinking about something else. That summer, I worked at the magazine 4 days a week and spent my evenings at Mrs. Sullivan's kitchen table writing. Not journal entries. Stories. I had always written in the margins of my notebooks, little fragments of things. But that summer something opened up and the fragments became pages, and the pages became something I didn't quite have a name for yet. Mrs. Sullivan read everything I gave her, with a red pen, and without mercy, and with more care than I had ever received from anyone in an official teaching capacity. She knew how to find the exact sentence that wasn't working, and explain why without making you feel like a failure. She was the best reader I had ever had. Brooke graduated from Millbrook High the following June. My father and Diane threw a party in the backyard, white lights strung between the trees, a cake that said, "Congratulations, Brooke," in Diane's favorite pale blue frosting. I was 17 and I stood near the drinks table for 2 hours, waiting for my father to introduce me to the relatives I hadn't seen since before the divorce. He introduced Diane first, then Brooke, then circled back to the conversation he'd been having with his Uncle Phil. I refilled my cup twice. His cousin Margaret found me eventually, peered at me with kind, slightly confused eyes and said, "Wait, you're Roberts? His daughter?" I said yes. She said, "Well, you look just like him." My father, across the yard, caught my eye. He smiled and lifted his cup slightly, a quick acknowledgement, a toast to nothing. I went home with Mrs. Sullivan that night. Carl had made a pot of chili, and Patrick was visiting from Chicago, tall and easy, and full of stories about his thesis and his neighborhood, and a restaurant he'd discovered that made the best banh mi he'd ever had. We ate around the kitchen table until midnight, the 4 of us, and I laughed harder than I had in months. When I finally walked back across the street, I realized I had stopped thinking of it as going home. Senior year, I got into UVM. Full scholarship, partial housing grant, work study in the university library. I printed the acceptance letter and brought it to my father at breakfast. He read it once, quickly, and said, "That's great, honey." Then he said, "Diane wants to know if you can make it home for Brooke's move-in day at Middlebury. She's nervous and could use the support." I folded the letter, and put it back in my pocket. I brought it to Mrs. Sullivan instead. She read it twice, slowly, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright. She said, "I always knew you would." Patrick called that evening from Chicago and said, "Congratulations." I told him it was mostly the scholarship that cinched it, and he said, "Don't do that. Take the whole thing." I tried. The 4 years at Burlington were the first time I felt like I existed at full size. I majored in English with a concentration in creative writing. I wrote constantly essays and stories and one long sprawling thing that my advisor called a draft, and I called my entire heart on paper. I had friends who knew my name in context, who texted me without a reason, who saved me a seat. I came home to Millbrook for breaks, and spent most of my time at Mrs. Sullivan's, helping Carl with the garden, arguing about novels with Mrs. Sullivan over tea, sometimes sleeping in the guest room when the drive back felt too late to bother. My father's house felt smaller every time I visited. Not physically, Diane had actually renovated, opened up the kitchen, added a sunroom off the back. It was bigger and cleaner and decorated in a style I didn't recognize. My childhood photos were gone from the hallway. A framed print of the Vermont mountains was there instead. I looked for the spot where my kindergarten art project had once been taped to the refrigerator, but the refrigerator was new, and stainless, and blank. I asked my father once, just once, directly, "Do you know what you did?" We were standing in the garage, him at the workbench, me in the doorway. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me. And for a moment his face was open in a way it hadn't been in years. A little raw, a little surprised. He said, "I know it wasn't perfect. There was a lot going on." I said, "You put me in a box in the basement, Dad." He set down his screwdriver. He said, "That was about space, not about you." I said, "It was about me. I think you know that." He didn't say anything. I didn't wait for him to. I walked back across the street. Graduation. Burlington, May. A Saturday that couldn't decide whether to be warm or cold. Mrs. Sullivan and Carl sat in the third row. Patrick drove in from Chicago, taller than I remembered somehow, with a new jacket and the same easy laugh. They cheered when my name was called. I could hear Mrs. Sullivan over the general noise of the crowd, clear and steady. I looked for my father in the rows of faces, and eventually found him on the far left, standing a little apart from Diane and Brooke, clapping. After the ceremony, he hugged me and said I was proud of you, and his voice was real when he said it. I believed that he meant it. I believed that he had always loved me in the way that people love things they don't know how to keep. I told him thank you. Then I went to have dinner with the Sullivans. That was 8 years ago. I live in Burlington now, a third-floor apartment 2 blocks from the waterfront, with windows that face east and bookshelves that cover every wall and a kitchen where I have learned, slowly, and with considerable trial and error, to make all of Mrs. Sullivan's recipes from memory: rosemary chicken, apple cake with brown sugar topping, the soup she made on the first cold night of every October that smelled like something you could fall into and never want to leave. I work as an editor at a small independent press that publishes literary fiction and narrative nonfiction. I am very good at finding the sentence that isn't working. I learned from the best. Patrick moved back to Vermont 3 years ago. Consulting work, an apartment in Montpelier. We have dinner most Sundays, sometimes at his parents', sometimes at mine, sometimes the 4 of us together in whichever kitchen is warmest that day. Carl retired last spring and has taken up woodworking, which he is enthusiastically mediocre at, and we all pretend to admire the lopsided bookshelf he brought me for my birthday. Mrs. Sullivan is still reading, still teaching in the informal way she has always taught, still making tea in the evenings, and leaving the table free for whoever needs it. She is the person I call first when something good happens. She is the person who talks me through the hard nights, patient and direct, with no softening of edges that don't deserve to be softened. Last Christmas she gave me a small ceramic star she had found at a craft market, gold, imperfect, painted with obvious love by someone who wasn't thinking about resale value. She didn't say anything when she handed it to me. She didn't need to. It hangs on my tree now, above everything else, and every December I look at it and think about the things that break and the things that are built from the breaking. My father called me in September, 2 months before his 25th wedding anniversary with Diane. His voice was warm, a little careful, the voice I knew. "We're doing a dinner," he said. "25th is a big one. Diane and I would really love to have you there." I listened to him explain the restaurant, the date, the the fact that Brooke and her husband were flying in from Portland. He said your presence would mean a lot to both of us. He said I know things haven't always been easy between us. He said I hope we can get past that. I waited until he was finished. Outside my window, the lake was going silver with the first cold of the season. I had learned over the years that there is a right moment in a conversation, a still point where something true can be said without it becoming a war, and I have learned to wait for it. I said, Dad, I'm glad you and Diane are happy. I mean that. He said, but? I said, I'm not going to be there. He was quiet. I said, I'm not angry at you. I don't need you to apologize, but I have spent a long time building a life with people who chose me, and I don't want to spend an anniversary dinner pretending that what happened when I was 15 didn't happen. It wouldn't be fair to anyone in that room, including you. He said, I was trying to keep the peace. I said, I know. I said that for a long time I thought that meant I was the problem, that keeping the peace required someone to stay quiet and make themselves smaller and eventually disappear into the basement in boxes. I said I don't think that anymore. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter. He said, I should have done more. I said, yes. He said, I don't know how to fix it. I said, I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm just telling you no. We talked for another 20 minutes about ordinary things. His woodworking hobby, which he has taken up in the last few years, he said. The garage smelled like sawdust again, and something in his voice was young when he said it. I asked about his health. He asked about my work. It was not reconciliation, but it was something. A door left slightly open, not an entrance but a possibility. I have learned the difference. I did not attend the party. The night of the anniversary dinner I had the Sullivans over for dinner instead. Patrick brought wine. Carl brought the lopsided bookshelf he'd been working on for 2 months, which was somehow worse than the first one, and we all praised it sincerely, and he looked so pleased that the praise became real. Mrs. Sullivan brought the apple cake. I made the rosemary chicken the way she taught me, with the lemon wedged into the cavity and the garlic pushed under the skin. We sat at my small table with the chairs pressed close together and the windows darkening with early October, and talked for hours about nothing that required explanation. Mrs. Sullivan told the story about the time Patrick flooded the basement trying to fix the washing machine himself. Patrick told the one about the time I fell asleep at her kitchen table junior year, and woke up with a grammar textbook impression on my cheek. Carl said he was going to build me a better bookshelf next, and Patrick and I looked at each other across the table, and both looked quickly away. At some point Mrs. Sullivan reached over and put her hand on mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. That is the thing about chosen family. They don't announce themselves. They just keep showing up, with tea and dinners and lopsided bookshelves, with patience and a kitchen table, and the particular gift of being present without making a production of it. They find you sitting on a porch step after school, and they open the door and they say the table is free. And over years and dinners and late evenings and ordinary Sundays, the word home shifts in your chest and reroutes itself, quietly and permanently, toward the light across the street. My father's house in Millbrook is still there. I drive past it when I visit. The sunroom addition has held up well. There are different lights on the porch now, not the blinking ones from my childhood, but steady warm ones in a row. Sometimes I sit in the car for a moment before I drive on. I don't feel what I used to feel when I looked at it. Not the hollow thing, not the reaching. What I feel now is something closer to understanding, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, maybe not ever, in the form people expect forgiveness to take, but a kind of clear sight. I can see my father for what he was, a man who loved me and could not figure out how to love me and 2 other people at the same time, and chose what felt manageable, and told himself it was temporary, and by the time he understood what temporary had cost, the distance was already built. I can see my mother too. I can see Karen's apartment, and Gary's polite nods, and the pull-out couch, and the way she said she was glad I'd come with relief in her voice. She was not a villain. She was a woman who had gotten herself a second life, and didn't know what to do with the pieces of the first one. I was one of the pieces. I don't spend much time in those houses anymore. Brooke texted me last spring. She's a physical therapist now, 2 kids, a house outside Portland with a garden she's very proud of. She sent me a photo of her daughter, 4 years old, with Diane's dark eyes. Beautiful, I texted back, because she was. Brooke said, I've been thinking about when we were teenagers. I was oblivious to a lot. I told her she was 16. I told her she had nothing to carry. We text sometimes now. Nothing heavy. Pictures, recommendations, the occasional check-in. It is the relationship we were never given the chance to build when we were young, tentative but sincere, built on the understanding that neither of us caused what happened, and both of us came out of it, carrying things we had to set down slowly, one by one, over years. The ceramic star catches the light in the mornings. Some days, I sit at my desk by the window and watch it turn, small and imperfect, gold where it was painted with someone else's love, and I think about all the things that have been made in this apartment that will outlast the making of them. The stories in the filing cabinet, the friendship that became family, the recipe for rosemary chicken, written in my own handwriting in a notebook with a blue cover, because someday I will want to teach it to someone else. I think about a 15-year-old standing in a hallway with a gold star in her hands, listening to the sound of being erased, setting down the thing she loved best and walking away before the silence could say it first. I wish I could tell her that the setting down was not the end, that the things left on end tables have a way of finding their way back to you, changed, held by different hands, given new meaning, that the table across the street will always be free, that someone is always about to open the door, that you will build a life from what survived the breaking, and it will be, in all the ways that matter, more yours than anything you were ever handed. If you were me, would you have gone back? Would you have sat at that anniversary table and smiled and pretended the basement boxes were just about space? Would you have decided that blood is worth more than what you built from nothing, out of need and luck, and one kind neighbor with an unlocked door? I am Maya Sullivan now, not legally, not on paper, but in every way that has ever mattered, in every kitchen and conversation and late night and ordinary Sunday, I belong to that name. I chose it, the way they chose me, without paperwork, without ceremony, without anything except the patient accumulation of days. And when people ask about my family, I tell them about the Sullivans. I tell them about a kitchen that always smelled like something baking, about a table that was always free, about a woman who read everything I wrote with a red pen, and without mercy, and with more care than I had language for at 15. I tell them that is the thing that held,